This work is based on research that Richard Rothstein has done that culminated in his book, The Color of Law. We are looking at some examples of federal law that resulted in a kind of urban suburban disconnect that led to much of what now we criticize as lack of racial integration. And I would like to argue that we no longer need to ask for diversity. We need to up the stakes a bit and ask for racial integration in our urban and suburban environments. We will be using Richmond, California as a case study. Richmond was a town that saw much housing construction after World War II, and which now is a less than optimal housing environment. And we are going to look at what Rothstein defines as a preventable ghetto in Richmond because certain specific laws led to the results that we have today. There is a concentration of, for example, white population in the suburbs and of African American population in the inner city that started after World War II. And the questions that both Rothstein's research and this paper asks are, what happened in Richmond, California after World War II? Were there pre-existing conditions that led to the conditions that we see today? Was there a lack of grassroots community initiatives that could have resolved it? And wasn't there even one individual that was willing to break with the status quo? So the first question we'll address is, were there pre-existing conditions? In 1940, there were 24,000 inhabitants in Richmond. In 1945, there were 100,000. The increase had to do with the production for the war effort. From those inhabitants, 270 in 1940 were African American, and 14,000 in 1945, just 5 years later, were African American. So the conditions, whatever they were being made in the early 1940s, because that's when a large number of African Americans moved into Richmond. We're going to explore this in the way that Rothstein explores it, which is by following the life story of Frank Stevenson, who moved to Richmond in 1943. So it was part of that huge population increase. He was born in Louisiana. Stevenson was born in Louisiana in 1924 in Lake Province, so rural Louisiana, where many African Americans still had to depend on using other people's land to grow crops. This was not the case with Stevenson because he was the son of a pastor at the First Baptist Church. And the church owned land, which meant two things. The first thing was that it could house the church could house the school teacher, the one-room school teacher, the one-room schoolhouse teacher in the church. And the second thing that could happen is that whatever they grew was on their land, so they could sell outright, and they could also have a vegetable garden for their own needs. So Stevenson attended this one-room schoolhouse in Louisiana until 7th grade. And then when it was time to go to high school, the situation was such that it was not accessible. He would have to, it was too long to walk. There was no way to get to the high school from Lake Province where he lived. And so he started working in 1936 in New Orleans, Louisiana, with one of his brothers. Generally, African Americans, when they were working in the ports, they were carrying bags of cement. They were doing low-skilled, heavy lifting work. He was there until 1943. And then in 1943, he moved to Richmond, California. Now, what was it about Richmond that made it so popular during World War II production in America? It's the deep water port. It allows for shipbuilding. It allows for big transport. And the war effort motivated all of this workforce to come to Richmond because production had been increased so much. So essentially in 5 years, the entire character of Richmond changed, both because of the increase in population and also because this was when African Americans moved into the town. So all these people were part of this war workforce, and because there was a need, they called on the white women to come help. They called on the African American women to come help, and the photos of the work environments that you see from this time are incredibly moving, because you have people from many different backgrounds, women, men, African Americans, whites, all working together, all pulling together. The housing was a different story. This huge influx of people coming into Richmond necessitated the building of housing, and in fact, there were some new housing units built, 24,000, but that didn't really meet the need that Richmond had for housing at that time, which was more like 76,000 left over from the 100,000 that were moving in, that were living there now. And a peculiar thing happened that Rothstein points out through his research. The white homeowners that were already in Richmond received low interest loans to add a room to rent to white workers, and a developer received bank financing only if he agreed to sell to white families. Each new home included a room to rent with a separate entrance as well. So there was a new rail line established to bring workers to the industrial area and the port, but this was for the white families that were living in the already established white suburbs. For the African American families, the housing that was built near the rail stations. Also, even though they worked together, movie viewing and any other kind of entertainment was still very segregated. So the kind of housing that was getting built for the African Americans that were moving into Richmond was very poor quality comparatively. It was not built as a permanent structure. It was built as temporary housing. And there were so few units available that African American workers were allowed to move into, that families had started doubling up, and this, of course, led to crowding conditions. The probably the most important thing that Rothstein points out in his research is that the segregation that was being implemented as all of these African Americans were moving in with the rest of the workforce to Richmond was that there was an effort coming from federal law that towards moving white families to single family homes in the suburbs, and of keeping the African American families in the in apartment buildings. Initially, apartment buildings have been built for white families and African American families in distinct locations. But eventually, one by one, the white families were offered low interest mortgages in suburban houses, single family suburban houses. And so one by one, the white families moved to these ownership houses, whilst the African American families remained in the buildings, in the apartment buildings. And while the white families were building a bit of equity with these low interest loans, that the bank was providing the low interest loans, but the federal government was guaranteeing them, was insuring them. While the white families were doing this, the black families had to deal with overcrowding, had very few options as to where they could go. And this is what Rothstein talks about in terms of ghetto. A ghetto is a place that presents obstacles if you were wanting to leave it, and does not present many opportunities where it is. In any case, for us as architects, understanding that not only was there this segregation that was pretty much mandated from the federal government, there was also this division of building type, that the African American families were essentially made to live within these apartment buildings, and the white families were offered the option to live in single family suburban homes. So, as a result of these policies, in 1945, half of the African Americans in Richmond were still living in this temporary housing because they had nowhere else to go. And in 1950, 3/4 of African Americans were still living, in warehousing. So Ford, the vehicle making company, was taken over by the war effort during the early 1940s. Ford initially had moved to Richmond because of all the communication links it offered via highways, via rail lines, and via the water. The port was able to handle cargo ships. So in 1931, it opened a plant in Richmond, thanks to the rails and the waterways, but also some tax incentives. Then in 1941, United Auto Workers, the union, negotiated a contract with Ford Motor to prevent from firing African Americans, to make way for returning white veterans, or from white workers laid off from military production at the shipyards. In other words, the union, the workers' union, was fighting for these African Americans to have a good industrial job, and they were able to to get this for them, because in 1945 the black workers had secure industrial jobs with Ford when the army gave up control and gave the company back, gave the factory back to the private company. So here's another aspect of this era that Rothstein points out. So in the 1940s, in the late 1940s, once Ford is producing cars and trucks again for consumer use, the African American workers and the white workers are together in the factory. But even after white families left Richmond for the suburbs, thanks to the low interest mortgages, there was still not enough housing for African Americans. Stevenson managed to go North Richmond and to trade maintenance work for rent with an elderly woman that he was living with. But others had to stay in cardboard shacks or in barns, tents, and even out in an open field. In the factories, African Americans started in the lowest and most strenuous job, but because the union fought for them, eventually they had more skilled assignments. And after about 10 years, Stevenson was able to substitute for the highly skilled workers while they were taking their lunch break. So he had achieved a certain skilled level within the workforce. These families in North Richmond could eventually save enough to buy a plot of land, but because the banks would not give them loans, because the federal government wouldn't insure the loans, they would not build proper homes, and instead they used orange crates and scrap lumber from shipyards to build their houses. So it's the 1950s, and these single-family homes have propped up in the suburbs, and every single-family home needs a car, and so production in the factory was quite good, which was very good for the African Americans employed within it. But it also meant that in 1953, Ford would close the Richmond plant and move 50 miles south to Milpitas, which is a suburb of San Jose, and at the time very rural. It's now part of Silicon Valley, but at that time it was very available for this sort of development. It was very flat. There was a lot of space, so Ford could build their entire factory in one floor instead of the two that they had in Richmond. The union negotiated that 1,400 workers in the Richmond plant would be relocated to the Milpitas plant. And among those, there were 250 African Americans, including Stevenson. But Milpitas had been a suburb of San Jose. But when residents heard the Ford plant was coming, they incorporated and hastily installed a city council to ban apartment buildings, only single-family homes. In other words, only the single-family homes, which were only accessible through the low mortgage rates to white families, were allowed to be built. No apartment buildings, which means that for working families, the homes could only be financed through the low interest loans banks offered. But since the federal government wouldn't insure mortgages for single family homes sold to African American families, banks would not approve loans, and a single family home was not an option for Stevenson. So what he ended up doing was renting a van and share it with 8 other workers that lived in Richmond but worked in the new Milpitas Ford plant, and made that trip for 20 years, 1 hour each way. Only one of those 9 riders that was in the van was able to move south a little closer to the plant, and only in the 1960s to a town called Hayward, which had been previously closed to African Americans. So in Milpitas, developers set to work. They created subdivisions of inexpensive single-family houses for the workers, not only at the Milpitas 4 plant, but at the other plants that Western Pacific had drawn to the area. And what we have then is we have a lot of suburban development happening in Milpitas around the factory, and the only apartment buildings available to the African American workers remained in Richmond. Now, I've introduced here a European apartment project because this is part of our argument later about how we might go from here. Okay, so the more low-interest loan suburbs were built for whites, the more segregated Richmond became, until, by Richard Rothstein's definition, it became a ghetto, a concentration of one race in a place where opportunity is limited and living is difficult. And so now that we look at this map again, of course, you have this division, because the kinds of opportunities that were made available exclusively to white families were not available to the African American families. And so the initial condition that we had to start asking, were there pre-existing conditions? Absolutely not. There were no pre-existing conditions. It was only the doing of these bylaws, of this bylaw segregation, that led to this segregation. Absolutely not. And the solution is essentially to have equitable mortgages, and to allow the suburbs to be integrated, not just the cities. I think it's a mistake to think of just resolving what's going on in the cities. I think it's a question of going back to the original reason why the segregation occurred, which was that opportunities were made available to one group that were not made available to the other, and essentially just ensure that those two provisions are equitable. And the other proposal I would make is to look to European models of apartment buildings, and see if there might be some models that could be experimented with in even in suburban settings, mixing it in with the existing suburban settings in the United States. Okay, the second question we had was there a lack of community initiatives? No, there were community initiatives. Okay, so what about one person? Was there even one person that was willing to break with the status quo? Yes, and the outcome was even worse. We have the Fair Housing Act now, which has been used to make housing more equitable for all, regardless of race, of sex, of color, of national origin, of religion, of family status, and of disability. There's a certain culture that happens when apartment buildings, where dense urban fabric works. There's also the opportunity, I think, to rethink the suburbs. The image in the middle is from the Truman Show, the ultimate fantasy of a perfect world that is so perfect because it doesn't really exist, or it's not real. But I think that there is an opportunity, I think, to rethink how two typologies that after World War II were so diametrically opposed, but that now perhaps there could be some architecture thinking that goes into mixing the two. I also think that no matter what, any kind of housing approach has to always come back to the politics and to who's in power and what they're thinking and what they're aiming to do. And also a kind of cultural education of sorts. If we become familiar with the stories like the story of Frank Stevenson. And finally, I will leave you with these two images, one from the 1940s when a multiracial, multigender group of people were working together towards a war effort, and one from this year in our current war of sorts, and how once again it is the multiracial, multigender group of people that wins the day. Thank you.